Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is our monthly Rabbis Cantors series that we're calling Devar Torah of the Month Club. I'm really wonderful with the titles. So today we're going to hear from Rabbi Adam Shalom, whose bio I'm going to read in a moment. But first, I want to let you know that this series is for members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and our affiliated communities and congregations in the US and Canada. And it is a thank you for your support as a member. We rely on membership dues and also donations. We are a nonprofit organization, and we can only do what we do through philanthropic support, tzedakah. So thank you very much for that. It is recorded, it is posted to YouTube for everybody to watch. Most of the programming we do is free and open to everybody, but we wanted to also carve out some programming that is just for our members as a thank you again for your support. So today we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Adam Shalom, who has served as the rabbi of Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation since 2004. Rabbi Shalom earned a BA in Judaic Studies from Yale University, a master's degree in Hebrew and Jewish Cultural Studies at the University of Michigan, his rabbinic ordination from the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, and his PhD at the University of Michigan. Rabbi Shalom is Dean for the North American chapter of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which is the leadership and rabbinic training institution of the worldwide movement of secular humanistic Judaism. He also serves on the executive committee of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis and is on the editorial board of the quarterly magazine Humanistic Judaism. And recently, together with Rabbi Jody Kornfeld, he co-edited the book Contemporary Humanistic Judaism: Beliefs, Values, and Practices. So welcome, Adam. I'm going to spotlight you and remove my spotlight and take over from here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining us both live and in the future. It's interesting to have the power to speak to the future, but we can do that in the world of technology. Today's Torah portion we're going to be discussing technically was last week's, but because this is living on the internet, any time could be valid. It's the portion called Shemot, which literally just means names. Doesn't really tell you very much about the content of the portion, but that's sometimes the case because Torah portions take their name from the first few words or phrases at the beginning of the portion. They were not chosen necessarily for the content of what was going to be covered in those several chapters. And this basically covers the first 5 chapters plus one verse from chapter 6 of the book of Exodus. In fact, the name of the book of Exodus in Hebrew is Shemot, just after that first Torah portion, where its Latin title in the Latin translation made much more sense to the content of the book, Exodus, because the major narrative in that book of the Torah is the leaving of Egypt by the Hebrew slaves and the beginning of their identity as the Israelite nation. So we're at the very beginning of that story in chapter 1, but we have to set the scene. The scene is that at the end of the book of Genesis, the family of Jacob has moved to this land in Israel, led by Joseph, who was sold into slavery and so on, and then manages to emancipate himself and become very successful. The family goes down and they begin to set down roots in Egypt. That's the scene. Now, before we dive into the actual text, and we're going to take you on a tour of the text of this Torah portion as a way of explaining the key points in it, we have to think a little bit about how humanistic Jews read the Torah itself. Certainly, we can read these stories as stories. They're literature. They're written with characters and plot and development and allusions and insights into the human condition. We may or may not agree with some of those insights, but we certainly can learn from them in understanding the authors and what they were trying to accomplish with their telling of this story. Also, of course, the Torah and early Hebrew literature and the Hebrew Bible as a whole is foundational for Western culture. You know, you're not going to get the jokes or the references in so many other parts of our experience without knowing these stories. And sometimes knowing the subtle details in the stories adds to our understanding of our own culture. So literature is one lens through which we can look at the Torah text. A second lens is the lens you might say of archaeology. We are reading this text for clues to what really happened in the history. We don't necessarily believe that it's describing exactly what happened, exactly the way it happened, because most likely it was written centuries later. There are some inconsistencies and plenty of other details that make believing it on face value problematic. So instead, we read this text and look for the clues for who wrote this, and when did they write it, and why did they write it, and what other stories might they have been reading when they were creating this narrative. What was their agenda, and how did that affect how they tell the story? This particular Torah portion has a really wonderful example of that near the end in chapter 4 and 5 that demonstrates who the authorship of at least part of this story might be. And we also keep in mind that when you're talking about authoring stories in the ancient world, many of which began as oral traditions that were told by word of mouth, it may be that there are multiple versions of the same story that get worked together into one final text, and you can sometimes see the stitch marks where they were sewn together, or the inconsistencies where they'll make a statement that is not actually true based on other sources in the Torah as we have it today. If you are religiously inclined and you are a profit organization as opposed to a non-profit organization, and as you believe in prophecy, then you're going to find a way to make those contradictions harmonize. It's a deeper truth rather than a disagreement. But if you assume, like we do, that there isn't prophecy in the world and that we human beings are writing and editing texts, then you're willing to admit there may be mistakes, inconsistencies, or other problems with the sources. And then the third lens, in addition to literature and clues for archaeology, is the lens of ideas and values, philosophy, theology. You get more of that, certainly the values point in the legislative texts that are later in the book of Exodus and certainly in the other books, later books of the Torah. But sometimes you'll get a bit of the what were the beliefs of our ancestors, either the people at the time of the story or more likely the people at the time of the writing of the story. What did they believe about the universe, about God, about humanity, about challenges that people face? And we'll see, again, an explanation of that as well. So with that overview, we're going to jump into our Torah portion for Shemot. I'm going to share with you a web browser that has the text in Hebrew and in English. For those who are competent reading the Hebrew, you're welcome to glance through that. And this is a website called Sefaria, which is a wonderful online resource for Jewish sources, be they traditional Bible texts, but also rabbinic texts, and again in multiple languages. They even give you options of multiple translations if you want to try different English versions of the story. So here you see the beginning of the Torah portion in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, as we count them now. And again, you see that word Shemot as the second word in Hebrew, just highlighting the names of the children of Jacob that become the tribes of the Israelites. Joseph dies. The Israelites are fruitful and multiply as they were commanded to do in the beginning. And then in verse 8, we have this key line. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, a new king could be a good opportunity, right? A chance for a change. But in this case, things were going pretty well for the Hebrews, and then this new king has arisen. Here's a place where people who want to try to prove that the Exodus narrative is historical try to find a hook. Because there is archaeological evidence of a Semitic people called the Hyksos, Hyksos, if you want to look them up later. The Hyksos invaded from the Levant, which is today the land of Israel, and conquered Egypt for a period of time. And you can imagine that if there was a kind of Hebrew people or Hebrew tribes all the way back then, this is around, let's say, 1700 BCE, if there were a Hebrew people or tribes back then, that would have been a congenial time for them to be in Egypt because a fellow Semitic people is in charge. However, a few hundred years later, the Hyksos were overthrown by native Egyptians and a new pharaoh arose. And one could imagine that if you had been allies with the outsider Semitic Hyksos, you were no longer welcome guests in this land where the Egyptians are now in charge of their own fate, or at least a pharaoh is in charge of the Egyptians' fate. So this is one of those lines that may be a hook into some kind of archaeological connection, or at least a memory of an archaeological moment where a new king arose and changed a lot of circumstances. There are other kings in the Egyptian chronology that make radical changes, including one who imposes a kind of monotheism on Egyptian practice, which historically was very polytheistic. And some people will try to date the Moses narrative to that time period because Moses is thought to be coming out with a monotheistic view of the world. Sigmund Freud does this in his Moses and Monotheism, for example, even though he wasn't really an archaeologist and some of his claims are, dubious to say the best. So, what does this new Pharaoh who arrives, again, entering the world of the narrative? This new Pharaoh says to his people, the Israelite people are too numerous. Let us deal wisely with them. Interesting, the translation says shrewdly. In Hebrew, it's chokhmah, which is just wisdom. But when it's wisdom with a negative intent or an evil intent, then we might call it shrewd, cruel, calculating, whatever you want to choose for translation. Because the fear is that they'll join our enemies in fighting against us. They're a fifth column, so to speak. And so they oppressed them with labor, and they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. By the way, that name Ramses is an interesting clue because the last three sounds of Ramses, or Ramses, as we sometimes say in American English, is MSS. Well, do you know anyone else whose name is MSS in this story? Of course, it's Moses. And so it may be that the name Moses, which I think literally means born of or son of in Egyptian, it has its same root as Ramses, which just means son of Ra, the god. When we get to the etymology of Moses' name, we'll see this a little bit more clearly. In any case, it's unsuccessful, this attempt to oppress the Hebrews. They continue to increase and spread, and so they begin to add worse and worse labors. The king of Egypt calls the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, and tells them, you take any boys that are born and kill them, and the girls you allow to live. Of course, the boys could become warriors. The girls could become war brides or simply slave brides. But the midwives, in a sign of their piety, do not do what the king of Egypt tells them, and they allowed the boys to live. They're called to account, and Pharaoh says, why have you done this? The midwives respond, the Hebrew women have too much life in them. Before the midwife gets there, the baby's already out. And so they're rewarded by God, and again, the people continue to multiply and multiply. And these are sort of two of the heroines in the early part of the story, these midwives who, in a kind of passive resistance, are allowing the Hebrews to live. And the midwives, in fact, get their own household. So now Pharaoh charges all of his people. You see a boy that's born, you throw them into the Nile to drown them. But the girls are allowed to live. So here's the circumstance. A plague of killing of sons, right? Of all the Israelites. Does that sound familiar? A plague of the death of, well, that will come up later in in Exodus, in the narrative of the Exodus, because the plagues on the Egyptians include the death of the firstborn in the 10th plague. There's also a parallel in later literature drawing on this story in the birth of Jesus in the Gospels, in the New Testament, which originally are written, for a Jewish audience. And they describe the circumstance where Herod wants to kill all the boys that might be born because a Savior might arise. And so then Mary and Joseph have to flee from Galilee, where they're from, down to Bethlehem. And that's why Jesus is born there. But again, there's an echo of this Egypt story of the someone seeking the death of the child that causes a kind of miraculous delivery. But that isn't unique to Jewish literature either. There's a king of the Akkadian Empire named Sargon, and he most likely historically ruled in the 2200s BCE, but there are plenty of stories about him that develop over the centuries. And a much later story about Sargon describes how someone sought his death, and his mother put him into a basket and sealed it with pitch and put it into the river, and he floated away to safety where he was adopted. Again, that narrative probably sounds familiar because here in chapter 2, we have exactly that same event. A member of the house of Levi took a wife, she had a son, and she hid him for 3 months to enable him to grow. But she could hide him no longer, and so she gets a basket, and she covers it with pitch and bitumen, and she puts the child into it to put it along the waters in the Nile River. And his sister stands nearby to watch. So you can see this is where the literature part of it comes in. This is very dramatic. You've got a threat of death, you've got a baby born, he's cast on the water, and you can almost picture his sister hiding in the reeds a little bit distance away to see what's going to happen to her baby brother. The daughter of Pharaoh comes down to bathe at the Nile, and her maidens walk along the side. She sees the basket among the reeds and sends a slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child was crying, and she took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Now, how do you know? How does she know that it's a Hebrew child? Well, there's a few possibilities. It could have been circumcised, although the Egyptians also circumcised to some extent. It could have had Hebrew cloth attached to it, which is how it's presented in Cecil B. DeMille's version of the Ten Commandments. It could be that the sounds of his voice sounded like Hebrew language, although it's only 3 months old, so unlikely. But in any case, it could just be the circumstance that she knows that all these Hebrew children are being killed, and maybe she connects the dots and figures out that a mother has left this child to drift. But it's clearly not an anonymous adoption because she knows the child is Hebrew. And as we'll see, the child knows the child is Hebrew. So if you've heard a version of the story where Moses didn't know that Hebrew's Hebrew and then suddenly he discovers it, well, that's a retelling of it, shifting the details a bit. The original story, in its dramatic build, is not about Moses discovering that he's a Hebrew. It's about him assuming the mantle that God gives him to try to save the Hebrews. And that's a different mantle. That's taking the mantle of responsibility that Moses tries and tries again, as we'll see, to dodge. So once Pharaoh identifies the child as a Hebrew child, then his sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go get you a Hebrew nurse? I know someone who's still lactating." His mother. And so Pharaoh's daughter says yes, and the girl called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take the child with you and nurse it for me, and I will pay you its wages." So for its first year, 18 months, we don't know how long, Moses actually lives at home with his mother and his family. And it's only later, when the child is grown up, that he's brought to Pharaoh's daughter, and she fully adopts him. And at that point, not at the point that she finds the basket, she names him Moses, which draws on a Hebrew etymology of masha, to draw him out of the water. But as we saw, that name Ramses has a clue that maybe this is an Egyptian name. And there's also sort of the incongruity. Why would an Egyptian princess use a Hebrew etymology for the name? Well, for a Hebrew audience, they would get the joke. But they're not always thinking in terms of, plausible fiction. So sometime after this, after Moses had grown up, he goes out to his kinfolk, and it says right here, he knows who they are. Literally, Achav, his brothers. And he sees their labors. And here's the scene where he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he looks both ways. He strikes down the Egyptian and hides the body in the desert. Later, he goes out, he sees two Hebrews fighting, and he tries to break up the fight. And they respond to him, "Are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian?" And now Moses knows the news is out, and he has to flee. This is this sort of herky-jerkiness of Moses assuming the mantle of leadership, where he does something, but then he has ambivalence about it. And in this case, now he's afraid of the consequences. In fact, wisely so, because Pharaoh seeks to kill Moses after he hears the news, according to the story. And so Moses flees. He winds up in a land far away called Midian. He ultimately meets his wife there. We're going to skip over that part of the story for now. The king of Egypt dies. And then, of course, a new Pharaoh takes power. And the Israelites cry out for help, and their cries rise up to God. God hears the moaning, and he remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, here's a theological question. Did God forget the covenant? Does he need reminders? Should he set an alert on his smartphone to remember that he has a covenant? I mean, what does it mean that he all of a sudden hears them crying and then says, "Oh yeah, now I remember"? Or is it more of people trying to interpret the events and explain the bad things? A classic role of religion is explaining tragedy and disaster. How could this happen if we have a God that loves us, if there's a God in charge of our fate? Well, this is one attempt to try to do that. I mean, maybe he was busy dealing with the rest of the universe and couldn't focus on just one people. Maybe the people weren't focused on the God, so the God sort of distanced itself as the people had distanced themselves. It's an attempt to try to explain how they were slaves at all. Now the covenant is going to be renewed. And this again gives us a clue into the context of writing this. Many passages in the Torah, scholars speculate, were written either during or after the Hebrew people had been exiled to Babylon around the year 586 BCE with the destruction of Jerusalem. And they're living under captivity in the other direction, to the east instead of to the west, where it would be to Egypt. And they're longing for a return and a deliverance. And so for them to hear this story about Hebrews living under a suffering regime, under an experience of slavery, captivity, whatever you want to call it, and then they'll be remembered, and then they'll be delivered. That's a narrative that those people need to hear, or that they value hearing, or maybe if it was written after they had returned, after they'd been freed by the Persians to return home from Babylon, maybe it's a reaffirmation of their own memory and experience of once we were slaves, now we are free, to quote the Passover Haggadah. So the Babylonian exiles who were able to return to Jerusalem would see this story of the slavery in Egypt and a return to a promised land, or in this case, a trip to a promised land, because they're not returning at this point in the narrative. That would be itself a reflection of their experience. It's a reaffirmation of the covenant they experienced in their day, projected back to this early proto-history or mythical origin story. God looked upon the Israelites and he noticed them, or he was aware of them. So that's the covenant theology projected back into the narrative. So Moses is living in Midian, attending the flocks of his father-in-law, Yitro, or Jethro. And he comes to Horeb, which is described as the Mount of God. Now, you might have said, isn't the Mount of God Sinai? And you know the old Jewish joke where one person says, X must be true, the other person says, Y must be true, and the rabbi says, you're both right, and then someone says, how can they both be right? And the rabbi says, you're also right. Well, it's Horeb and it's Sinai. Again, it depends on which source you're drawing on, which tradition. They might have different names for the mountain, or a disagreement on which mountain is really the holy mountain. That's the clue finding that we're experiencing in this part of the story. So he comes to this mountain of God, and a messenger of Yahweh appears to him. So you'll notice it's referring to the Hebrew God as God, or it's referring to God rather in verse 1, where in verse 2 it starts talking about Yud He Vav He, which is the Hebrew name for God. I pronounce it as Yahweh. Some say Yahweh. In a traditional Jewish setting, you would never say the name out loud like that. If you were praying, you would say Adonai, which means my Lord. If you were referring to the name, you would say Hashem, which just means the name. But you wouldn't use the name directly because, it's like Voldemort. He who shall not be named. You don't want to say the magic words. So one of the clues here is in the Hebrew grammar, because the word for God in Hebrew is Elohim, which is generally a plural form. Sometimes it's a collective noun, like Mayim, water, could also be waters, but how do you find one water before you're, understand atomic theory or molecular theory? So Elohim is like the gods, the divinities, the divine realm, and then Yahweh is a specific God within that realm of the gods. After all, in the climax of the Exodus, when they're crossing the Red Sea, there's that famous song at the sea, Mi kamocha ba'elim, who is like you among the gods, often translated in more pious views as who is like you among the mighty. but there's clearly a sense of the God of the Hebrews judging the gods of other peoples and being more powerful than all the others. That's Elohim, the divinities, and Yahweh is the specific God for this people, as we'll see developed even further in this passage. So a messenger of this specific God Yahweh appears in a blazing fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was not consumed by the fire. This is that famous scene of the burning bush. And Moses says, I have to check this out because you don't see this every day. Moses calls out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he answers, Hineni, here I am. This is a classic motif in biblical literature. Same thing happens to Abraham at the binding of Isaac, where the angel calls out, Avraham, Avraham. He says the name twice to make sure he's heard, to re-emphasize the importance. And the human responds to the divine call with this one phrase in Hebrew, Hineni. Behold myself, I am all present, I'm all in, I'm focused on you, and I'm available for what you want. So this is that beginning of this covenant between Moses and the Hebrew God Yahweh to lead the people, is that first statement, Hineni, here I am. So now the God or the angel says, again, it's unclear because initially it says a messenger of God. Malach is also the word for angel, but then it begins to be Yahweh itself talking to Moses. So now it is said to Moses, do not come closer, remove your sandals from your feet. The place on which you stand is holy ground. I am the God of your father's house, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hides his face because he's afraid to look at God. There's an interesting debate throughout the book of Exodus, and for that matter, the balance of the Torah, over whether you can actually see the face of God or not. And sometimes Moses is described as a unique prophet who saw God panim el panim, face to face. In other times it says you're not allowed to see God's face. And the shading of God's face is one of the expressions of power by the priests, who are the only ones allowed to come even close to God's face. So they want to add to the mysterium and the tremendum and the power of the image of God. So he hides his face. He's simply listening to the voice. Yahweh says, I have seen my people, the plight of my people in Egypt. I have heard their outcry because of their slave masters. I am aware of their sufferings. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land to a good and spacious land. This is a classic Zionist song as well. Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Notice, by the way, even in the book of Exodus, there are already people in the land. It is not an empty land that they are coming to. They claim a right to the land because of a divine promise in this story, but they acknowledge that there are already people there who will have to make room. And so God continues, the cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. I will send you to Pharaoh, and you will free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. So now begins the give and take. Moses is a fascinating story in leadership as a narrative because he doesn't want the job. He doesn't think he can do it. He's not sure he can trust the God to follow through. He's not sure the people are going to listen to him. He's not sure he's going to be successful. He has self-doubt. He has mission doubt. He has all kinds of reasons not to do it. And there are plenty of times at the beginning, as we'll see, that he tries to get out of it. So first, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? I'm basically a nobody. Okay, my family are Levites. That's sort of a holier tribe than maybe the others, but I'm a nobody. Who am I? This is a question we ask ourselves, by the way, when we're faced with a dilemma, with a task, seemingly impossible task, when we're faced with an implacable foe like a Pharaoh. Who am I to act and do something? So God responds, I will be with you. This shall be your sign that I sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you will worship God at this mountain. So here's your mission. Get the people, get them out of Egypt, bring them here to meet me. Don't worry. You've got a friend in me. maybe quoting a different canonical source these days. Moses then says to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your father's house have sent me, they'll say, what is God's name? What shall I tell them? You see, first Moses says, who am I? But then he says, who are you? This is a voice. This is a burning bush. How do I verify you to them? And here God says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. It's a future form of the verb to be in Hebrew. Hebrew doesn't actually have a present tense for to be. You simply say, I hungry, I tall. You don't have to have it to be. There's a past tense, I was, there's a future tense, I will be, but there isn't a present tense. And this passage is really trying to provide an etymology for that name for the Hebrew God. If you look at that name, Yud-He Vav-He, Yahweh, you notice that it has some of the same letters as the verb to be. It has a He, a Vav, and a He. Sometimes that Vav can become a Yud. You have a Yud at the beginning. So this name of this God, Yahweh, actually appears in Canaanite literature too. He was a Canaanite god, along with other Canaanite gods. It became the special god of the Hebrews at a later point in history, and this story is an origin story for the name. Why do we call him this name that sounds a lot like to be, was, will be? Well, because his name actually has a root in that verb. Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I will be what I will be. So you say to the Israelites, Ehyeh sent me to you. And you will say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my appellation for all eternity. Lador, dor, like generation and generation in the future. Go and assemble the elders of Israel. Tell them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers. Again, notice the repetition of the names and the repetition of the rhetoric. That's one of those indicators of an oral tradition, because often oral stories would have repeated passages coming back again and again. Go to those people and say, I remember you. I've taken note of you and what has happened in Egypt, and I've declared I will take you out of the misery of Egypt and to this promised land, which we just heard about before. Again, it's a repetition of that passage, but now this is the next step in Moses' evolution. He's not just going to talk to God. He's going to hear what God says and share that to the people. When you hear what a God says and you pronounce it to the people, that's what we call prophecy. So this is clearly a claim that what Moses is teaching to the people is a prophecy. It's a direct oracle from the God through the human mouth out to the people. And so sometimes you'll get these passages where it seems kind of repetitious. God just said this to Moses. Now he says, go to the people and say this to them. And then you might get another passage in the story where Moses goes and says it to them. And we get to hear it 3 times. But that's the pedagogy of the oral tradition of telling a story so people will understand the message and hear it multiple times. And then Yahweh predicts they will listen to you. And then you go to the king of Egypt and you say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has shown himself to us. Now let us go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God. Is that a lie? Well, yes. Because Yahweh's goal is not to take them 3 days into the wilderness. He already said the goal is to go to the promised land in the land of Canaan. Is God allowed to lie? Well, I mean, if it makes all the rules, then I guess so. And who's the court to appeal to, right? But in this case, it's a cover story. And it's more than that. It's a, what would you call, a reasonable request. Our God wants us to go out in the desert and offer a sacrifice to him. It's temporary. Don't worry. And if Pharaoh won't even allow that, that begins to start the ball rolling towards an ultimate, complete exodus. And Yahweh knows this is what's going to happen. I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of a greater power. And the phrase that's used is Yad Chazakah, a mighty hand, which raises the question, does God have a hand? You know, later generations of Jewish philosophy would try to abstract God into a very nebulous form, but Biblical versions of theology clearly have a God with legs and feet and arms and hands and nostrils and emotions because he gets jealous and he gets mad. It was a much more projection of the human experience kind of God than an abstract philosophical God in the text of the Torah. So I will stretch out my hand. There you go. And I will strike Egypt with various wonders, which I will work on them. And after that, he will let you go. I will dispose the Egyptians favorably. You will not go away empty handed. Women will borrow from their neighbors and despoil the Egyptians with lots of gold and beautiful objects. You get back pay, basically. There was actually a case where an Egyptian jurist, sort of for a joke, tried to file a legal claim against Israel for all of the gold and silver that were taken by the Hebrews when they left. And then my recollection is Alan Dershowitz threatened to file a counterclaim for the 400 years of back wages from slavery. And if you're going to take the story as true, then you could argue either side of that nonsense argument. So the point here is Yahweh knows what's going to happen. This is like the preview or the storyteller's preview of what's going to happen the next several chapters. We're going to ask to leave. He's going to say no. We're going to cause terrible things to happen to them to show my power and to finally enable you to go free with some kind of sustenance and support and affluence even as you leave. But Moses has not said yes yet. Here again, we get this ambivalence of the leader who doesn't want to lead or doesn't trust that he can. Moses spoke up and said, what if they don't believe me and don't listen to me and say, Yahweh didn't appear to you? What if they claim I made it up? Or they think I'm hallucinating, as we might say today if someone says, God spoke to me. Yahweh says to him, what's in your hand? It's a rod. Moses throws it on the ground. It becomes a snake. Moses jumps back. Remember, we don't like snakes. That goes back to Genesis. Then you put out your hand and grab the tail, and it becomes again a staff in Moses' hand. This is a sign, says Yahweh, that they will believe that Yahweh, the God of their ancestors, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, appeared to you. Again, notice the ancestors, the claim of the pedigree is brought again and again. Moses gets a second wonder. He's able to put his hand into his cloak and bring it out and then have it be encrusted with snowy scales and then put it back in and out, and it's clean again like the rest of his body. And if they don't believe the first sign, they'll listen to the second one, says Yahweh. And if they don't believe both signs and they still don't listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground, and it will turn to blood on the dry ground. So I'm giving you three wonders that the people will believe, because if you can do that, you must have some kind of divine power. And yet, still Moses resists. He says, please, oh my Lord, I have never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you've spoken to me. Even if you give me all the speech to give, you're my speechwriter. I still can't deliver. I am kaved lashon. I am heavy of tongue, and kaved peh, heavy of mouth. What does it mean to be heavy of mouth, slow of mouth? Well, you could imagine maybe a lisp or some kind of speech impediment, simply someone who doesn't have the gift of gab. The rabbis actually use this as an opportunity for creative imagining, something called midrash, where you take a story and you see a quirky detail and you want to add to the narrative. Even if you can't write a new story, it's like in the spirit of, or imagining the space between the words. So in this case, they imagined that at one time, Pharaoh was suspicious of this child that his daughter had adopted. And so he put two items in front of Moses, a crown and a glowing hot coal from a fireplace. And initially, Moses reached for the crown because he knew he would be in charge and have power. But an angel guided his hand instead to grab the coal, and he burned his hand. He was so hot, and his hand was so hot from burning it, that he put it in his mouth to cool it, and it singed his tongue. And that's why it says he is slow of tongue, or heavy of tongue, because of that moment. So this is the rabbis creating a story to explain a particularly odd phrasing in a later text as a creative response, and again, adding to the story, retelling the story as a story that can still be valid. Even if it never happened, it's still an interesting exercise to do, just like what today you would call fan fiction, or people write new, Harry Potter stories or whatever. So Yahweh said, I gave people speech. I make them deaf, dumb, seeing, or blind. So don't worry. I'll tell you what to say. And finally, Moses tries to resign. He says, please make someone else. Send someone else. Use someone else. So finally, Yahweh, again, you see the emotion, gets angry. In the Hebrew, it's actually vayichar af. His nostrils flared, which is a sign of anger. And so he says, you see your brother Aaron, the first time we've heard of Aaron, you see your brother Aaron, he can speak fine. Even now he's coming out to meet you. He'll be happy to see you. You speak to him. You put the words in his mouth. I'll be with you and with him as you speak, and I'll tell you what to do. And he will speak for you to the people. And thus he serves as your spokesperson, you playing the role of God to him, and take this with your rod. So here is the clue. Who's writing this story and why are they writing it? Well, Aaron becomes the prototypical priest who runs the temple in Jerusalem. Later generations called Zadokite priests take their name after his grandson, and later in the narrative, they all claim descent from Aaron. This is that Cohen gene that people talk about. But also the phenomenon of the priests. Anyone named Kahan or Cohen or Katz has this claim of a pedigree to the priests going back to Aaron. And what's the role of a priest? To translate the words of the God to the people. And so that's the role Aaron plays in this. He does the rituals. He'll actually be the one to put the staff down that turns to a snake in front of Pharaoh. And Moses is the oracle. Moses hears the God, he speaks to Aaron, and Aaron will enact what the God has prescribed. Remember, this is happening centuries later, the people writing this. And Moses is the author of the Torah, so claimed. Well, if the Torah is telling you what to do, and the priests are enacting what the Torah has prescribed, it's the same dynamic as here in the beginning of the Exodus story. God spoke to Moses, Moses wrote it down, the Torah is now Moses, and the priests are now Aaron, and the descendant of Aaron reenacting this ritual as the text prescribes it. So this is a justification story for the role of the priests in later centuries of Jewish experience. Now, there's a really fascinating passage here about a bridegroom of blood and an emergency circumcision that we're just going to have to skip. Although we do get the idea of let my people go beginning to phrase in here at the end of this pronouncement from God to Moses. So we're skipping the bridegroom of blood passage because we don't have time to dive into that. Moses and Aaron go and assemble the elders. Aaron repeated all the words that Yahweh spoke to Moses, and he performed the sign. Again, Aaron performed the signs in the sight of all those assembled, and they notice that Yahweh noticed, and they're willing to go along. So now they go to Pharaoh. And here we get that famous phrasing as we're used to it, let my people go. Yahweh says, let my people go to celebrate a festival in the wilderness. So that's not the let my people go that we think of. But the first time it's said is this ruse, this let my people go to sacrifice in the wilderness. And Pharaoh asks a reasonable question. Who is this Yahweh? I know Ra, I know Amenhotep, I know Osiris. Who is Yahweh? I don't know him, and I'm not going to let you go just for that. And they answered, he's been shown to us. Let us go for 3 days in the wilderness, or else he might strike with pestilence and sword. But the king of Egypt again says, why are you distracting people from their work? Go get to work. And so now Pharaoh begins to make it harder. This is that classic narrative of you have to go down and down and down before you can come up. The Hebrews have to suffer even more before they find their deliverance out. They are no longer given straw to make bricks, and they have to collect it themselves. And so the people have even more work to do. And they're punished because they can't make as many bricks. So now they come back to Moses. And they say, may Yahweh look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and his courtiers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us. What have you done? You said you were going to free us, and now it's worse. And then Moses goes back to Yahweh and says, what did you do? This is a classic like triangulation. where the people complain to Moses and then Moses goes to God and then God talks to Moses and Moses goes back to the people. He's the intermediary. But remember, that's the point of the authors, that the people need an intermediary to relate to this powerful God, and that's going to be priests and their revelation, the words of Moses, the book of Moses, the Torah. But Moses, again, is trying to get out of the job. Why did you send me? What's the point here? And one of the other themes, by the way, is lack of faith or doubt. You see doubt throughout the Torah narrative because the people continually doubt what Yahweh is going to do and can do. And even Moses has it at the beginning. Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's dealt worse with his people, and still you've not delivered your people. And then the return, and that's why I think this Torah portion is concluded at this verse. Yahweh says to Moses, "You will soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He will let them go because of a greater might. Because of a greater might, he will drive them from the land. And that Yad Chazakah, that strong hand, will be the hand of God intervening to make things right." Now, if you have faith in the hand of God intervening, then you'll never doubt, or you shouldn't. Of course, the Israelites doubt again and again and again. Now, if you're a Jew living in the 3rd century BCE, or the 5th century of the Common Era, or the 1500s, or today, and you look at the world, and you see Jewish people suffering, and you see disasters happening, and you feel like you're a slave, oppressed, hated, persecuted, pursued, you could say, I read these stories and I'm comforted. Because even though there was slavery, even though it got worse and worse, ultimately, both the deliverance took place and my enemies were punished. There was justice in both directions in the world. That's the classic religious interpretation of the story. But how we might read it, who doubt that kind of divine deliverance, is instead to say, people have complained forever. The Hebrew people kvetching predated Yiddish and the term kvetch. We have been a stiff-necked people because the world doesn't match our expectations. And bad things happen. You see, for us, the constant is not divine deliverance. The constant is human difficulty and suffering, human failure, pharaohs, and the need to save ourselves, the need to answer that question, who am I to confront Pharaoh, with you are you. You have worth and dignity, you have power and importance, you have people to collaborate with, so it's not just you alone, but y'all who are coming up to speak. And you have power to make a difference. That's tough to believe. That's why in previous centuries, relying on miracles and magic and divine promise felt necessary. But given the failures of those divine promises, given the forgetfulness of a God who doesn't save Jews from Auschwitz or October 7th, then maybe it requires people to act, and we are all that's left. We are the ones that need to do what cannot be done by supernatural means at the best of our ability. We are not all powerful, but we are not powerless either. So with that, I'll stop. I'll see if there's any comments or questions in the chat, or if you'd like to offer some, please do.
Thank you. Amazing. That's all one portion?
That's all one portion, chapter 1 to 5.
I wonder if someone has put together a top 10 list of like the parshas with the most stuff happening in them. Like I know like the first one, right, covers billions of years, but there's a lot going on in this. I had one question and then I'll open it up if anyone else wants to. You had said the name Moses, it just implies I was born.
In Egyptian, MSS, that sound, I believe means born of or son of. So
Uh-huh.
Ramses is the son of Ra, the
Uh-huh.
Egyptian god. So it's a very common name in Egyptian records. You see either MSS or some prefix with MSS in Egyptian records. So there is some echo of Egyptian experience in the story. But remember, the lines between the countries were not as rigid as they've been, since 1948. Like people
Right.
crossed boundaries and moved. Egyptians conquered parts of the middle of the land of Canaan for different periods of time. There was actually a Hebrew king, Josiah, who was killed by an Egyptian king invading. So, the lines between the cultures were not that rigid, and it's very likely that some Hebrews did have some experience of Egyptian culture. So that's a piece of real data that they had that name in their canon of names.
The line is I named him Moses because I drew him out of the water, though, which to me implied that she's named
Because
him Moses.
In Hebrew, the root masha
Ah,
or masa is to draw out, to pull out,
got
or
it.
to lift
Okay.
up.
Interesting.
Um, yeah.
Great. Anyone else have questions? You can just come off a mute or raise your hand.
I can't have answered all the questions. Peter, please. If
There
you're
you go.
talking, Peter,
Okay,
we
now
can't
yeah,
hear you. There you
now
go.
I got the mute back. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that classic film Ten Commandments from 1956, not talking to the 1923 silent version of Sesame DeMille. So my main question for all audiences, what did they get quote unquote right, and where did they really go way off base? So because this informs the public for the last 70 years for
Yeah, because people,
visual as interpretation.
yeah, how many people read the book versus watch it around Easter time?
Oh, the book
Yeah.
is always much better than the movie.
Well, I don't know. I've had a couple that vary from that, or I like the book differently than the movie, but they're both good. But in this case, yes, Cecil B. DeMille took some license. So one of them was he hid Moses's Hebrew identity from him until he discovers this cloth that's a Hebrew cloth that he was wrapped in as a baby, and then he begins to discover his identity, and so it adds to the drama. The romance between him and Nefertiti, that's not reflected here. But sometimes there are rabbinic midrashic stories that get worked in. So my understanding is the animated movie Prince of Egypt, which is also a retelling of the Moses story, takes some rabbinic midrashim and includes it in either the imagery or the storytelling that's presented in the movie. For example, there's a legend that the Israelites, when they were walking across the Red Sea and between the walls of water, they saw fish floating around in the sides, like almost an aquarium, and so that's depicted in the Prince of Egypt narrative of it. But this is one of our. So when you're saying got right or got wrong, you also have to investigate: did they get it right to the Bible text? Did they get it right to the rabbinic interpretations of the Bible text or medieval interpretations visually of this in Haggadot? There's even a fantastic picture from an ancient synagogue in Syria called Dura Europos, where they had these detailed mosaics painted on the walls of the synagogue of famous biblical scenes. One of the scenes they painted on the synagogue is Pharaoh's daughter rescuing the baby from the water. And she is buck naked. And you might say, what is that doing in a synagogue? And from our understanding, that's not what you'd expect to see in synagogue art and architecture. But in a Greco Roman context, maybe concepts of nudity or impropriety were very different. And some of those mosaics, again, reflect a midrashic understanding of the story. Others reflect their own interpretation, because once you take it from page to image, it's going to change. So, there's a lot of things that are important to changing the story. And, different people are going to retell it differently. I'm sure somebody has written a piece about where they got it right or where they got it wrong or changed it. I mean, my favorite example is the very end of the movie. Moses, or Charlton Heston, however you want to refer to him, has this big cotton beard that looks totally fake, and he hands over the Torah to Joshua. And there's this interesting paradox of Moses writing the Torah, but also giving the Torah. And how can you like be in the Torah, and the Torah describes his death at the end, and how does that work? So he gives the Torah to Joshua, and then he says, "Enter the land and proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants thereof." Well, that's not what the inhabitants of the land are supposed to get. According to Deuteronomy, they're supposed to be kicked out and wiped out. But what is that line in proclaim liberty to the inhabitants? Where does that appear?
The Liberty Bell.
It appears on the Liberty Bell, exactly. Because Cecil B. DeMille is doing this film in the 1950s. It's clearly a Cold War allegory for slavery to men or freedom under God, as he says in his preface video. So he's retelling it through his lens of the Cold War and his lens of Americana and what today we would call Christian nationalism. It's not an accident that a lot of those people want to put 10 Commandments on lawns. Many of those monuments were originally made to promote the movie.
And by the way,
Now they've been
also,
taken
you
over for
mentioned,
politics.
sorry, Adam, by the way, you mentioned about the preface. ABC, when they show it, they usually cut that introduction, that 5-minute stand up for a broadcast. But if you look on the DVD, it's really quirky. It's a little goofy. At the same time, he's trying to say, I have serious scholarship on this. So he's trying to back it up with if you look at the credits, he's have reverends and a rabbi. And so he's trying to make the best of it. So I appreciate what texture you gave to it. I'll see it differently now.
Great.
R. Coleman, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name.
Mr. or Ms.
Um,
You're good. Go ahead.
I'm trying to I'm trying to get the camera to work. Oh, it does work. I have a question for you. The idea that a prince in the household will get into trouble for killing some lowly official always factors in. And there's some suggestion is that, assuming the story is true, is that Moses was actually a rebel. He was part of an opposition to the Pharaoh. And this is why he was fleeing, because he thought this is something the Pharaoh might use against him, kind of thing. So the idea that Moses, whether he was a Hebrew or not, if he was raised in the household as the grandson of the Pharaoh, is unlikely to have gotten into trouble for killing somebody. And yet he flees. And I know the rabbis made a lot out of that as well. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that aspect
Sure.
of
Well,
it, the
there's
story?
also a comment. There's also a comment in the chat suggesting that he doesn't fly into a rage. It's kind of a premeditated action because he hides the body. There's a lot of what I would call space in the text where it doesn't say as much detail as you might want. Now, some of that's a function of the fact they're writing on animal skins. They're not even including vowels because they want to save as much space as possible. You don't get a lot of narratives that talk about people's emotions or what they were thinking or feeling. So it's a very condensed style of narrative. Is Moses a rebel? Well, you could read it that way. This is the idea of Devar Acher, another interpretation, another perspective on the text. The rabbis are often kind of projecting what they would want Moses to be at the time. I like to read him as the ambivalent leader, as the person who's asking how to get out of it rather than how to get into it. All those questions he's using at the mountain and even after he's returned to Egypt, where he says, "Who are you and who am I and how are they going to believe me and look what you've done." And he's trying to quit. He tries to quit. So I think more than a Che Guevara, who's trying to help the people to rise up, I see more of the ambivalent, reluctant leader, like in American history, Adlai Stevenson was drafted to run against Eisenhower a second time in the mid-1950s after he had lost badly the first time, and he was sort of the reluctant candidate who was sort of dragged along into it. Well, I see Moses more like that, but maybe that reflects my experience of leadership, and I'm projecting that onto Moses too, like everybody else.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to be mindful of your time and everybody else's for being here. It's very much appreciated, and we will do this again the third Thursday of the month for the next 4 or 5 months. And appreciate you, Adam, for this. Very fascinating as always. And it's actually been a year and a day since your last one. I didn't realize till I was finding your bio again, and I'm like, wow, we're pretty consistent. So
You could just make a recurring calendar event
yeah,
and then
there
it'll
you
pop up
go.
every year.
But thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great day, and we'll see you all again soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.